Hey guys, sebchoof here. Today I have the second part of the bow tier list covering the sniper based bows. These are the bows where when you're using them you don't have to worry about kissing the enemies in order to do decent damage, because they don't have the spread of shots that like tiered normal bows do. Instead they're like concentrated damage. The bard ability also makes the shotgun bow's shots travel further, but it's just as hard to hit since it doesn't help the spread. You still have to get close range to make them most worthwhile. Just a quick recap, this is the tier list that we've done so far. If you want to watch me cover these bows, I've got a separate video that you can watch after. But here's the breakdown of the tiers, because this tier list is dependent on how accessible items are. I don't find too much point in just doing a raw power ranking, so I want this to be a guide, because a bow can be criminally hard to obtain, and only slightly than another bow would be comparing it to. And on a raw power ranking tier list, it should be slightly higher, but I do feel like it should be way lower, if I want this to be a guide, which I want it to be. I'll include a raw power tier list in this video as well, not taking into account how accessible items are. But just to quickly brush you up on what the tiers are, we have the S tier, the extremely worth the farm tier, the A tier, great to use, worth the farm, B tier, good to use, only kinda worth farming, then we have the C tier, worth using, only slightly worth the farm though, and then D tier, slightly worth using, but not worth farming, so if you do come across it, maybe it's worth using. And then E, just never use these, okay? Just never use them. You're probably gonna be surprised what ends up from this video on this tier. By the way guys, this tier list is just my opinion, so please don't report me on Reddit. Anyway, let's first talk about the staple sniper bows, the tiered longbows. These actually often do more damage than their one tier up on their normal bow counterparts. So like for example, the tier 11 longbow outdamages the tier 12 bow at 0 defense. But since longbows have no armor piercing shots unlike normal bows, it doesn't scale against enemy defense well. Longbows do over 10% less damage than normal bows at 50 defense on the same tier. Though with the normal bows, you need to hit all of the shots to do the bow's full damage, which can be really hard. So in reality, it can do a lot less damage. Like for example, you're better off using a longbow a whole 4 tiers under the normal bow if you're only going to hit the middle shot. The two negatives of longbows are they don't pierce, so longbows only really feel nice to use against a single enemy or a few. Like clearing a group of enemies with these is very cringe. Also, this kinda sucks, but burst fire weapons have their benefit capped at 75 dex. Any more dexterity and it doesn't actually increase your damage while using a burst fire weapon. And unfortunately, a lot of the bows we'll be talking about today are burst fire, so take that into account when we talk about them. This is especially sad for bard players since they max at 70 dex, more than the other bow classes, so it's really easy to exceed that 75 dexterity. Anyways, enough yapping, back to the tier list. Just like with the normal tiered bows, I'll place the tier 11 to tier 14 longbows to set a nice baseline to compare all the other bows to. With the tier 11 longbow, it's really easy to gain, just like the normal tier 11 bow, dropping from dungeon bosses and events from the easier biomes, and it's as beneficial but at different times. In general though, at the earlier game I'd prefer to use the normal bow since it's easier to get closer to enemies early game, and there's usually more enemies for you to clear during that stage. I'd put the tier 11 longbow just under the tier 11 normal bow at the A tier. Next, the tier 12 bow. It's the same deal as the tier 12 normal bow, where it's much rarer than the tier 11 and only dropping from the veteran biome dungeons and events for not much of a power gain. I'll put it slightly under the normal counterpart again in the B tier. Now with the tier 13 bow, this one is spicier because as we mentioned in the first video, the normal tier 13 bow gets quite a damage jump from the tier 12, thanks to its side shots getting a jump in damage. The tiers don't go smoothly up in damage like you'd expect them to, but unfortunately the tier 13 longbow doesn't have that jump in damage. It's only a tiny increase, and it does only drop from substantially tougher dungeons, like Exalt dungeons like the Nest. So on the top of C tier you go. Now last but not least is the tier 14 bow, which is pretty interesting because this one does have the biggest jump in power out of all of the tiered longbows, at least after tier 7, and has a bigger damage increase compared to the normal tier 13 to tier 14 bow. However, you can only get it from the Shadow's last boss, making it pretty tough to obtain. By the time you get this item, you're probably versing more endgame enemies, which usually have higher defense, making longbows in general not as nice, and at this stage your dexterity might also be above the 75 mark. It still has pretty solid damage and range though. I'd put it at the top of the B tier. Alright, now for the most iconic sniper bow, You probably know what it is. It's the Doom Bow. Man, what a beauty this is. It never disappoints. This bow drops from the Septavius from the Undead Lair, and it shoots a singular high damage shot at a 33% fire rate. Against early game enemies, which is where you get it from, it's not as nice because it does actually do less than a tier 11 longbow worth of damage, but for late game, even though it drops from the peasant Septavius that even my dog can defeat, it's pretty strong. It actually does more than tier 13 longbow's damage after 50 defense. And of course it pierces, which is a big plus over the longbows. It's a pretty solid strategy if you're playing a bow class that's brand new to go for a Doom Bow for a massive boost in the beginning. For how strong it is, for how easy it is to get, how could this not be in the S tier? Another reason why the Doom Bow is great is you can substantially improve it in two different ways. It can get a strong awakening called the Soulful Mastery, or you can upgrade it into a stronger bow called the Clockwork Repeater. I'm gonna put both of these options on the tier list. Let's first talk about the awakening, the Soulful Mastery. Now, awakenings are not easy to get, and they can actually be an insane pain sometimes, but they can be worth it. Unlike with the Bramblebow awakening, this one is definitely worth it. Let's first start off with the strong negative that it has. It doubles down on the weakness of the Doom Bow, which is the fire rate. It actually halves how often you shoot, but it does increase your damage per shot by more than double, and it does increase the range from 7 to 8. It also gives you 33% more attack from any bonus wisdom, and 33% more wisdom from any bonus attack, but it doesn't end up being that much, to be honest. The damage alone is pretty insane per shot. It makes it do a flat 1111 damage per bullet, but because of the super slow fire rate, you really can't auto-fire because you can't afford to miss any shots. This works great as a swap out because the only issue that it does have is the fire rate, so you can swap something out that's better for clearing little shits. You also have to take into account when comparing to other bows that this takes up an enchantment slot and the possibility of getting other great enchantments like the Overwhelming Strikes or Flurry of Bows or damage percent increases. It is also going to cost you quite a bit of dust, but luckily it's only green dust, which is always quite easy to get. Now if you get a Doom Bow early into a character's life, the green dust is really worth using on this bow because the Doom Bow is going to stick with you for a while. This enchantment basically just makes this bow even better for the late game bosses. For how strong this is for even end game, especially for how easy it is to obtain, we have to put it in S tier, just under the normal Doom Bow. Now another option you have, which is similar, is upgrading the Doom Bow to the Clockwork Repeater. To do this, you need to get the enchantment core from the Cogbold Steamworks and combine them in the Forge. This is a much more consistent version of the Soulful Mastery, because it maintains the same fire rate when upgrading, so you won't be kicking yourself in the nuts when you miss a shot. But you do lose that one tile potential range increase. Clockwork Repeater does do 10% roughly more damage than Soulful though, and 20% roughly more than the regular Doom Bow, but it is much harder to get than both. However, this actually ends up being one of the strongest bows in the game. You'll see in the power tier list I show later that this ranks really high. Because of this bow's consistency and strength, this bow deserves to be in the S tier. Just under the normal Doom Bow, I think, and above the Awakening. Now I know people are screaming that the normal Doom Bow is above both of these options, but it's just so easy to get the normal Doom Bow for how strong it is, and this is taking into account accessibility. We'll have that raw power tier list later, don't worry. Of course the normal Doom Bow won't be as high there. Now next, we have a bow that is super similar to the Doom Bow, and it's criminally underrated. It's our first ST bow on the list, or at least in this video. It's the Resplendent Bow. Now this bow got buffed relatively recently, and this bow is easy to gain just like the Doom Bow since it drops from the Ancient Ruins, both the treasure room and the main boss. Now comparing this to the Doom Bow, it actually has a very similar fire rate at 35%, but it does roughly 5% more damage and has half a tile more range. On top of this, while farming for the bow, you have a chance to get other great items for bow classes. Because while farming for a Doom Bow, you can't really get anything else that is that cool. Like for a bard, you can get Toga Picta, which is okay. The ring from UDL isn't too cool. But from Ancient Ruins, you can get an amazing quiver, and the lever and the ring are okay, but the set bonus is really nice. It is worth using the other set pieces early on, if you do get them, with how strong they are, as a bonus. The quiver you can get from the set is crazy because it's one of 4 quivers in the game that can still slow, and it's the most usable and obtainable one. It makes the game much easier, especially end game, since slows are very rarely something that enemies can prevent, and the quiver still paralyzes. The ring from the ST set is not great at all, but it does make the quiver a lot stronger since it roughly triples its damage, since it shoots 3 times the shots, because you're wearing the ring. And yeah, as I mentioned, the set bonus is pretty damn strong. On a new bow class, my go-to strategy would be to farm for this bow, especially on Archer. You can even farm for Hamayumi while looking for the Resplendent bow. We'll talk about that more later, but because of how strong I think this bow is, it goes in the S tier, just above the Doom bow. Okay guys, we had 4 S tier bows in a row. Now we're done glazing, we gotta swap it right around. Next we'll be talking about another S tier bow, the Beginner bow from the Magic Woods. This bow is just not it. The unique feature of this bow is that it pierces enemy armor, but at this stage of the game, since Magic Woods is an early game dungeon, the enemies don't really have armor to pierce. The bow does have a great range, about half a tile over the Resplendent bow, but that's another thing you don't really need at this stage of the game, especially on a bow that does not pierce. Yes, it does not pierce, it's very cringe. One of the rare positives this bow has is that it has a normal fire rate, but if your bow pierces enemy armor, it doesn't really matter how often you shoot, and fire rate is better paired with a clearing weapon like Coral Bow, rather than a bow that does not pierce, and does weak damage to lesser enemies. Now, Beginner bow does do roughly the same as the Doom bow, but it deserves more due to its lack of piercing. It's something you really need early game. Now late game, this bow actually is pretty nice, but it's pretty easy to find something better. I do really remember enjoying this bow when exalting my Huntress on life from doing O3s, but Beginner bow was one of the rare bows that wasn't really buffed with the latest bow rework, and that was 4 years ago when I was using it often. Just like the Resplendent bow, there's other ST pieces of this bow set that you can find in the dungeon, but they're not as good. The trap is really good for Huntress since it does give you self-healing and berserk, buffs that you wouldn't easily be able to find if you're playing in a small group or solo. The lever from the Beginner bow set is a decent DPS level, assuming you're getting hit really often, which you can only really get away with early game since the enemies do less damage. Enemies late game deal way too much to be able to proc the dex boost that you gain. And the ring of the set is just pure garbage, throw it in the bin. Also, the ST bonus is also not worth it. It's really not worth going for this bow, but it can be worth using if you stumble upon it somehow, like if your Huntress is going for the trap. And even the places where the bow can be nice to use, it just gets outclassed by like Doom bow and Resplendent bow, since those are much more usable thanks to the piercing. I think this belongs at the top of D tier. Now, we're keeping the ST bow train going with the next one, which is the Deathless Crossbow. This boss drops from the second boss of the Curse Library, so we're already off to a bad start, because you have to spend quite a bit of time per dungeon to even get the chance of getting one, unlike the other early game bows we've discussed so far. But is it still worth it? Well, this bow's damage is quite similar still to the Resplendent bow, but it scales poorly against higher defense enemies compared to other bows, since it has a higher fire rate but no armor piercing. It does have double the projectile speed, which is quite nice, but who cares? But here's the big negative of this bow, other than the fact that you have to spend way too much time in the Cursed Library. It's got roughly a quarter less range than the other bows we've discussed so far. This bow clocks in at a 6 tile range, while the Resplendent bow is 7.5 tiles. So this bow has lower damage, range, and is rarer. That's just illegal. Now, can the other ST pieces and the bonus make up for it? The Cursed Library does drop a quiver that gives you speedy, and since they made Snake Eye Ring infinitely rarer since it's a white bag item now, it actually is a good option to go for on an archer, as it improves your movement speed to rush dungeons faster and farm them faster. But this quiver only drops from the first boss, so there's no need to do the second if you're going for the quiver. The lever that the dungeon drops actually is a great survivability armor, but this drops from both bosses, so just like the quiver, you can just kill the first boss and move on. And lastly, the ring is okay. It's a nice vit ring, but it's not nice enough. And the ring drops from both bosses as well, so I mean, the ST bow is probably the worst part of this entire set, and you can just avoid it completely while getting the other 3 pieces by only farming the first boss. There's not too much point of doing the second boss as a bow class, because that bow just ain't it. And just doing this dungeon in general probably isn't a good idea. The ST bonus is actually pretty nice for wearing 3 pieces, but I wouldn't wear the bow as one of those. Like, this bow is equivalent to between a tier 11 and tier 12 longbow anyway. So mad, so bad. I think this bow is lucky to not get placed into the lowest tier, but the bottom of D tier you go. Next up, we have the first event white on the list, the Hamayumi. This longbow is a rare drop from the Legion Gem General, the Goblin Patriarch, and the Jade Statue. All these events can spawn in the Abandoned City. Now this bow absolutely slaps. Its damage beats the tier 14 bow slightly at 0 defense, and then does more than 10% against 50 defense targets, since some of its shots armor break. It also beats the tier 14 normal bow at all defenses. It's got a nice 7 tiles range, but it does burst fire, so it does have that negative where if you're above 75 dex, the excess dex does not contribute to its damage. If you are using this bow, you want to avoid choosing dex over other stats when above 75. Another negative of Hammer Yumi is that it is an event white, meaning it's one of the rarest drops in the entire game, only dropping from the rare events I mentioned. But the Abandoned City is a great biome for the bow classes to vibe in, especially starting off, and since it has a healthy source of ancient ruins. So you can farm for the Resplendent bow set, and while doing so, you can slay the Abandoned City set pieces to try to get the events to spawn, while doing any ancient ruins that you see on the way, and yeah, you might be lucky to get that Hammer Yumi. It's hard to get a better bow than this one. It's gonna rank really high in the power tier list, so if your character does get this bow, it can be set for life. This is my new choice so far for the top of S tier. Now next, kind of similar, we have a biome UT called the Recurve bow. And honestly, other than the look of this bow, I don't understand why people like it, because it seems like there is a lot of people that do. Sure, if you hit all of the shots, it actually does do ridiculous damage. It's crazy. It would actually make it the 3rd highest DPS bow on this list so far, including bows that we mentioned in the first video, since this deals 22k damage in 5 seconds, and you don't even have to be right next to the enemy, like the Predator bow and the Bolt Thrower. So how is this going to turn around, you might wonder? Well, the big problem is that in reality, you're going to be doing way less damage, because to hit all of the shots from this bow, you have to stay at a perfect 5 tiles away from the enemy at all times. If you move any closer, this bow loses half of its damage roughly and becomes equivalent to a tier 7.5 longbow. And then, if the enemy is further away than 5 tiles, the damage decreases significantly again. Now, in practice, you'll be very lucky if the enemy isn't moving, making hitting this bow's shots consistently tough. And even when the enemy is consistently still, you need to also be still, but that's not too realistic because you have to be dodging, unless you're willing to get in combat, but then you lose damage from your ability, which might not be worth it. And at worst, you get hit by shots, so many of them that you die. I found that even easy still bosses, like the Puppet Encore boss, can be tough to solo with this bow and be accurate, because the damage from the bow just adds up. And if by some miracle you found the perfect scenario where you can stay accurate with this bow, while not having to dodge too much yourself, if the enemy does have high defense, the damage of the bow does drop off really hard. It does get beaten out by the tier 14 longbow at 50 defense. Plus, this bow is extremely hard to get, just like the Hammer Yumi, since this bow drops from minions in the Sprite Forest biome super rarely, and there's no real other good reason to be in that biome anyway, unlike the Hammer Yumi for the Ancient Ruins. Do yourself a favor and pretend this bow doesn't exist, putting this high in the D tier under the Beginner bow. It's time to return to a nice, reliable, standard bow. The Leaf Bow. Everyone knows this one. The bow drops from the main boss and the treasure room boss of the Woodland Labyrinth. It doesn't pierce and has slow moving shots, but it has nice range, fire rate, and damage. It does about 15% more than the Doom Bow against 0 defense enemies, but it does drop off more with enemy defense, having almost on par damage with a Doom Bow at 50 defense. There's not much to say about this bow, it's very normal, and it deserves to be at the very tippy top of A tier because it's amazing, but I do find it more worthwhile to go for bows in the S tier. Now, a way that you can make the Leaf Bow even better is you can get an awakening for it called the Swarm Tree's Wrath that bumps its damage up a nice amount. It gives the Leaf Bow these new burst fire shots, so yeah, they're subjected to getting capped at the 75 dex, but it's so worth it though. It gives about 10% more damage to your Leaf Bow against 0 defense targets, and 15% more, roughly, against 50 defense targets, making it a really strong option for even late game. It even beats the Resplendent Bow and the tier 14 Longbow at 50 defense, but it's still about 5% less damage than the Hammer Yumi at all defense levels. To get this bow, you need to get the regular Leaf Bow, then win the lottery by having the enchantment already on it as you get it, or re-roll your bow enchantments until you get it with Red Dust. It can be pretty costly on average. Red Dust is harder to get than Green Dust, but it's not not as bad as purple dust. And I do think it is a good strategy to go for the awakened leaf bow if you do have the normal one, since the awakened leaf bow does rival the damage of the endgame bows. And in terms of difficulty, it's pretty easy to obtain. It's just a bit of a grind for the dust, putting it in the higher half of the S tier above the Doom bow. Now, it's time for the 1000-shot bow. Holy moly. This bow drops from the Puppet Master's Encore, which most oftenly you can find in the Sanguine Forest, and man oh man. First, let's start with its solid damage. All of this bow's damage is armor piercing. The damage isn't as great against weaker targets like minions, being equivalent to the tier 11 longbow or the resplendent bow amount at 0 defense. But at 50 defense, it ends up beating most of the bows we've talked about so far, including the tier 14 longbow, and it's literally for no downside. Like, the damage against lesser enemies isn't even that bad. Plus, it almost has an 8 tile range, and it has extremely fast moving shots, so you won't have an issue hitting them at max range like you might with the longbow. A lot of bows are mostly just good on paper, like the recurve bow, but this bow is good in practicality as well, since it's so easy to hit the shots. It's pretty easy to get this bow as well, since the dungeon itself is a cakewalk, and you can find puppet encores relatively often in the Sanguine Forest, as I mentioned, or you can pay attention for events spawning in the Sprite Forest, since a lot of them drop the puppet encore. I mean, I think it's just the woman. Maybe. Pretty sure. It also is just a lot of fun. It's got an extremely fast fire rate, but avoids the usual penalty for it, which is not scaling well, but it does, since it does pierce enemy armor. It's crazy. Even for a newbie player, you will do wonders with this bow, since you can stay at a safe range and still do criminal damage. Deca had to be enjoying some substances when they decided on the recent buffs for this bow. Now, there are stronger bows, but since this tier list takes into account accessibility, this easily takes the top spot of the list, the king of S tier so far. Next, we have the Harmonious Harp. This bow is similar to the leaf bow, but the shots can be even more annoying, since they shoot even slower, though they do pierce. And it does do more damage than leaf bow, dealing about 15% more damage roughly at the 0 defense level, and 10% more at the 50 defense level, and it does hold roughly the same range. However, it is a bigger pain to get. You can either get this bow at a really rare rate from the Tundra Express Beacon Guardian, or an even rarer chance from some of the minions when clearing towards Chancellor Dharma in the Oryx Sanctuary. So if you are interested in this bow, one of the best ways to get it is after Oryx 2s. If someone pops O3, check if it's Dharma, and even if you're too much of a chicken to try the Dharma boss, you can just go in to kill the minions. This bow, I would say, is slightly more worthwhile using over leaf bow, but it is much harder to get, and you're not able to get that juicy awakening like you can with the leaf bow. I think this bow deserves to be in the bottom of A tier. Next, another ST this time, and it's the Nectar Crossfire, and oh boy, this is a piece of shit. It drops from the minions in the nest, and its damage is for some reason equal to a tier 10.5 longbow roughly, from an Exalt dungeon. What the hell, man? It also has a burst fire component, which as we all know, shouldn't be likable by now. There's no way you haven't found a better bow by the time you're doing a nest. I'm not trolling when I say I'd rather have the baked bow. At the very bottom of the E tier you go. No, the ST set bonuses are not worth it. Now time for another ST, the Experimental Cannon. This is a burst fire longbow that you can only get by crafting with a rare material that you can find from the Cogbold Steamworks. Usually, I really hate the STs that you need to forge, since they have such a high cost in order to acquire them, but this can sometimes be worth it. The damage on paper is great, basically dealing the same as the 1000-shot bow, but it does fire in like a line of bullets that's hard to hit consistently all the time. And it is a burst fire weapon, so you know, we're not a fan of those. It also has less range, less fire rate, less shot speed, so it's basically a 1000-shot bow from Temu. But if you're looking to get your Doom bow upgraded to the Clockwork Repeater, and you're doing the Cogbold Steamworks anyway, and you come across this upgrade material, it's an option. You can make this bow. If it's an upgrade, you might as well. It also does work really well with the ST ability from the same set for the Archer that drops a turret, since it boosts its damage and adds a slow if you're using both. You can even swap to the Experimental Cannon only when placing the turret in order to get that extra buff. And the ability is great. It used to be the best archer ability in the game until more recently when other quivers got buffed, and it still probably is best for players of a weak pet, since it's really mana efficient for its damage and its slow effect. But yeah, I wouldn't go out of my way for the experimental cannon. It's a C tier for sure. Okay guys, we're down to the second last entry of the list, and we have the Void Bow. Now, the Void Bow is amazing. It does great damage with really reliable shots. At 0 defense, it almost does as much as the Awakened Leaf Bow, and beats it at 50 defense. It just comes with two massive drawbacks. The lesser of the two is that it has a 6 tile range, making it a quarter less range than the Leaf Bow, which is pretty gross. The bigger issue is that it drops from the damn void. If you're a player that isn't using Discord to play the game, which I want to assume all of you are, since having to use a third-party program to play the game is quite cringe, and shouldn't be something that is expected on other players. But yeah, if you're one of those players that aren't using a Discord, doing this dungeon is hell on earth, especially if you don't have a bow as good as or better than a Void Bow by that point. Because first, you have to find the rare Lost Halls dungeon in the wild, and then go the opposite way from the void in order to get a vial from the cult. Then you have to find the same rare dungeon and go towards the void, but first have to kill NBC, which can be a tough fight in itself, and then you have to use that rare consumable to even open the void, and then good damn luck doing the void, because it's an extremely tough dungeon and it becomes exponentially harder if you're lacking damage. And by some miracle, if you complete the void, the chance of you getting the Void Bow is so slim, probably like a 1 in 50. Good luck, man. Also, if you have completed the void, at that point you probably have a bow that is equivalent if not better. Even though this bow is so great, it deserves to be in the top of the C tier for how unobtainable it is. It might even have to be lower, it just feels so bad putting it this low, but don't worry, this bow will have a glow up in the raw power tier list. Last but definitely not least, we have the Macaca Yumi, which is the bow from Umi, from the Moonlight Village. This is maybe the most interesting bow on this entire list, because it's an absolute powerhouse, but it comes with a steep cost. The bow has a primary projectile that shoots up to 7.5 tiles, it's fast moving, has a good fire rate, pierces, and the damage is disgusting. This single shot does more damage than all of the bows we've talked about in this video so far at 50 defense. Highest bow DPS until now was the Clockwork Repeater at 50 defense, but this one does roughly 20% more damage than that. And I'm not even including the other 2 shots that the Umi bow fires, which you need to be within 3 tiles of the enemy to hit, but it does add roughly an extra 20% damage to the bow. Holy smokes. So what's the catch, you might ask? Well, there's actually 2. The first is that the bow permanently slows you while shooting, making you extremely vulnerable to chasing enemies. I know if you're a Discord runner, you can almost always go ham with this bow in any situation, since you got other people covering your ass, but there's almost no Exalt dungeon in the game that you can solo with this bow. If you're not using this bow as a swap out, you're basically guaranteed to die. But when you can use this bow, which is like half the time, it is amazing. It can even help you with dodging, since slowing you down can help you with some phases, like all of the phases in Moonlight Village, the first bosses and Umi. Which brings me to my second negative in my opinion about this bow, which is that it's extremely rare from the dungeon that this bow is the most beneficial for. It's kind of counterintuitive, you know? It's kind of like how people talk about that contradiction where when you're looking for a job, everywhere's asking you for job experience, but how are you supposed to get job experience in the first place if you need the job experience to get one? You're just stuck. But yeah, this bow is amazing, and even after getting it, it is still worth doing Moonlight Village, since the bow is so good at it. You just deal with so much damage, making accruing flames a lot easier, and the self-slow makes lantern phases a lot easier as well. But yeah, while you're farming Moonlight Village, you can get a better Umi bow by getting more and better enchants, and you can also get other Moonlight Village wights like the Amazing Ring. It is also a great weapon to use while you're looking for the Umi pages if you're going for the skins. It is really great, just really tough to get, and that massive slow drawback. It might get you killed, but it's so worth it. In the middle of S tier in my opinion. Well, that's the whole tier list, 35 bows. Remember, this was a tier list about my opinion of the bow's power against its accessibility. Here's a tier list when only taking into account the power of the bows. So even if you need to chop your doodle off for one of these bows, and it deals 1% more damage than a bow that's extremely easy to get, it will place higher. Big shout out to the supporters on Patreon. Let me know in the comments what weapon or ability you'd like me to do a tier list on next. I'm leaning towards ranking Orb, orbs. What do you guys think? Subscribe for whatever it is, and follow my Twitch stream. I might be live now. Catch you next time. Peace.